Hello everyone and welcome back to a very special Kerbal Space Program video. And why is it special? I hear you asking. Well, I'm sure many of you have figured it out. Yes, this is the long anticipated, much requested reboot of Life on Laythe. The series I begun last year, in which we set out to colonise Jool's wateriest moon. But the thing is that whilst I started, I made some good initial progress. I ended up getting a bit sidetracked with other projects, just other things got in the way, and Life on Laythe sort of got pushed to the wayside. And since then, we had a new DLC come out, which kind of rendered the present ground stations in Life on Laythe a little bit obsolete. And in addition to this, Squad then started rolling out these incredible graphical enhancements for many of the planets, including Juna, the Mun, Minmus, etc. It kind of started to make Laythe look a bit less appealing to make videos of regularly, and with each update that passed and each graphical upgrade that came, it made the progress I'd made in Life on Laythe even more obsolete. So I decided that when Laythe finally gets a texture revamp, which of course it has, we will revisit Life on Laythe, but rather than go back to the old stuff that we did ages ago, we'll just do it all again from the ground up, but this time do it better. So that's what we're going to do. We've technically already started this series again with the Dragonfly Scout mission I made a few weeks ago, where we sent a little quadcopter to Laythe to kind of scout out the terrain, pick out any good spots for a ground station, stuff like that. But really, it was a very small autonomous drone. It ended up sinking as well, so there's no chance of recovery. So really, whilst we made some good initial scientific findings, really, if we want to make some meaningful observations of the moon, we should send some Kerbals and indeed a big science laboratory setup to Laythe orbit to establish exactly what we need to do to further our exploration of Laythe. And why is Laythe such an interesting target, I hear you ask? Well, the thing is that Laythe, it makes no sense, right? It's got liquid water on the surface, and it has oxygenated atmosphere to the point that jet engines with air intakes will work, and Kerbals can go as far as removing their helmet, and they can safely breathe the air. And that goes without saying that they can withstand the what you'd assume would be freezing cold temperatures of Laythe. So clearly, Laythe is very, very warm, despite the fact that it is so far away from Kerbin. It is effectively the same as Kerbin, but much, much further away from the sun. And why is that? No one really knows. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think it's very important that we go out and investigate Laythe and see if we can figure out for ourselves exactly what special secret properties are underlying that gives it the characteristics that it has. And that's kind of the thesis I went with for initiating the first season of Life on Laythe. And that's going to be the thesis that we stick with, because I'd say it's a pretty good thesis, and I don't see any reason to deviate from it. Now, as you can see, we have constructed two big gravity rings. We're using the breaking ground rotors to have them spin to create the artificial gravity. What might not have been quite so obvious, though, is the methodology that I employed to get those Mark II crew cabins in the symmetry they're in, because of course I used more than 8-way symmetry to create those perfectly round structures. I always find it really difficult to articulate how this is done, but I'd like to think that just watching the time-lapse you could sort of see what I was doing. The reason it works like this is basically because it exploits how KSP manages symmetry stacking. So if you take a strut with 6 more struts placed around it in radial symmetry, and then you take that strut and attach it to another strut, which it itself is placed in radial symmetry around a rotor, for example, let's say it's 6-way again, now what you have is 6 struts placed radially around a rotor, but attached to each of these struts is a strut with 6 radially attached struts around that. The game then treats these most peripherally mounted struts as being in 36-way symmetry, because it's 6 times 6. So if you then take that and drop it back onto the rotor, it maintains its symmetry state of 36-way symmetry, and then you can attach it to a crew cabin or whatever and offset that cabin into a position where a ring is formed. And that's how I did it. So you can theoretically go up to 64-way symmetry using this method here. I actually considered building the rings using 64-way symmetry for this station here, but the issue with that is that it results in a very, very, very large ring. And when you've got a very, very large ring with lots of part clipping and the whole thing's moving, well, basically the Kraken doesn't like it very much. It's very, very prone to glitching. They generally shake themselves apart. In fact, I did actually experiment with 64-way symmetry for this station here, so I can cut across to how that prototype ended up turning out. As you can see, not very stable at all, wobbles itself to pieces, and well, it would have met a very fiery demise very quickly. So unfortunately, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't really get the 64-way symmetry size to work. So we ended up going with, I believe I went with 36-way symmetry for this particular space station. Now, as you can see, I'm building these liquid fuel tanks through the structure like this. And this is good for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it reduces the overall height of the rocket because we're extending the fuel tanks through the upper stage so that the whole rocket doesn't end up being too tall. Because yes, these fuel tanks are actually going to be used to power the interplanetary tug that moves this thing from low Kerbin orbit to Laythe. The other benefit, and the main reason why I'm threading it through the structure like this, is that we can use it to provide an anchor point to keep those rings in place. We can't strut those rings to the space station core itself, because once we do that, we can't then remove those struts once we want to start turning the rings. If you fire up the motor, the strut will just hold it in place. It's not like a decoupler where the strut will just disappear when you stage the decoupler. So if you want to strut rings together to something, which you should when you're doing a launch to stop them from freely spinning and causing lots of instability during flight, you need to strut them to a big rigid structure like this. And in this case, I've gone with the fuel tanks here. We've got the fuel tanks to power the nuclear engines, but we can also use them as a structural anchor point for the payload. You noticed as well, I've got those hinges at the front. The reason is that we need to unthread these things at some point from the space station once we're in Laythe orbit. And at the moment, the way they curve at the front to get this thing, I don't know, vaguely aerodynamic, it's going to be very, very hard to detach them safely. So we've got those hinges, so basically they can unfold themselves and become perfectly straight. And then we've got those little SRB motors at the very front that will just then pull the fuel tanks through the structure and detach them safely. So that's kind of why I've got those hinges at the front here. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about with the gravity rings before we get too far into the construction of the rocket itself is that we've got two of them. The reason for this is because once you fire up the rotors of the gravity rings, if you've only got the one ring, and if it's quite big like these ones, it'll generate a lot of torque. And what you'll probably find is that when the ring starts spinning, the central station will begin spinning in the opposite direction, which we don't want. We want the main station that isn't in the rings to be stationary. So you could counteract this with lots of SAS units and reaction wheels, things like that, but these are very, very hungry for electricity, and it's not really an ideal solution. The better thing to do, which is what I've done here, is to have another ring of equal mass and size spinning in the opposite direction. Then the torque generated by the rings will counteract each other, and the central core station will remain still without the need for excessive SAS power. Speaking of power, though, we are, fairly, we're not very short of it, put it that way. We've got those big, I don't know what they're called, the cargo bays. I believe they came with the Making History DLC, the ones that are sort of attached radially to this crew cabin just here. And inside those, we have lots and lots of RTGs to basically mimic having nuclear reactors on board this thing, because that's effectively what RTGs are, just very, very small. I know, gross oversimplification, but go with me. It uses radiation. We've got lots and lots of those to provide power to create a nice nuclear power plant, and that sounds like quite a cool thing to say, but more importantly, we don't want to be too dependent on solar panels, because Jool, which is where Laythe is orbiting, is very, very far away from the sun. And it's so far away, in fact, that solar panels don't really provide much electricity at all. They only provide a fraction of the electric output they could provide at a height at, say, Kerbin's orbital height. So whilst solar panels work at Jool, they're really not an ideal power source to be dependent on, especially for a space station that demands an electric output such as this. So that's why I've gone with nuclear power for this thing's power source. And I think that's all the stuff I needed to talk about with the actual construction of this rocket here. You can see it looks like the readouts on the staging window say this stage only has about 2,000 meters per second of delta V, which is cutting it a little bit fine when doing a mission from low Kerbin orbit to low Laythe orbit. But if you look carefully at the staging window, you can see that stage 3 has almost 3,000 meters per second of delta V. That's right, that interplanetary tug actually has 2 stages to it, because of course we have that structural scaffolding stage of all the fuel tanks there. That's coming up as a separate stage on the in-game readout. So we actually have about 4,000 meters per second of delta V in total for our transfer to Laythe. So more than enough for what we really need for this flight. Now you can see me building the actual rocket that's going to get this thing into orbit. And you may have noticed, guys, that we are about 10 minutes into the video at this point, and we are still building the rocket. Now, I didn't want to cut down on showing the building of the space station because I think, like with crafts like this, watching the build is half the fun of the actual video. So I didn't want to just cut out bits of the build, but I also didn't want this video to be too excessively needlessly long. So in order to minimize this video's length and to make it nice and engaging for the viewers, I wanted to try and do all of this in one launch. You're not going to faff around sending the space station up in one launch and then the interplanetary tug in a second launch. That'll be wasting time, guys. We're going to try and do it all in one launch. Also, I am very lazy and this is just a bit easier. So as you can see, we've got that cluster of vectors to provide some thrust just there, but it's nowhere near enough fuel or enough thrust really to get this monstrous payload into low Kerbin orbit. So now we're going to add some flanking towers to the payload, and these are going to provide the bulk of our fuel and our thrust. So we're using the gigantic Saturn V parts that came with the Making History DLC. We're going to increase the number of vector engines as well, and we're going to shift those over to those side towers as well. The reason I'm going with side towers, that's the setup I'm calling it, rather than having a more conventional rocket where we just build the stages underneath the payload, is because you guys may have noticed that this payload is very big and very tall, and I did experiment with having just a standard rocket setup of having all of the lower stages underneath the payload, but it ended up being very, very unstable, very, very wobbly. It would always fall over. It didn't really fly very well. So I'm doing it this way to reduce the height of the stack, and more crucially, we can do this. You can see me adding these solid rocket motors just here. These are not actually going to be used as solid rocket motors. I'm just using them as structural anchor points. So I've drained them of their solid fuel. These are really, really great for providing structural rigidity to big structures in Kerbal Space Program, because those SRBs are very, very tall, but they're still, you know, fairly small in diameter. So they make great scaffolding pieces. The normal liquid fuel tanks are nowhere near as tall as those SRBs. So if we wanted to achieve the same effect using standard fuel tanks, either we'd have to use the gigantic Saturn V parts, which is not really viable in this situation, or we use these smaller Mark I size fuel tanks, but then we'd need lots and lots stacked on top of each other, thus compromising the structural rigidity. So these things really are the best part for the job. And I've put the ESA emblems on them because I just like that color scheme a bit better than the plain white. And that's the basic structure there. Now we are in fact going to double the number of side towers just there. I did just test this rocket with just the side two to see if that would be sufficient, and it wasn't. We couldn't get into orbit with just the two side towers, so we're going to double the fuel, double the engine, well, not quite double the engines, but double the engines of these side stages at least. And not only will that provide more fuel, more thrust, more energy, but it'll also increase the number of structural pylons we have around the rings, thus increasing our, strength during our ascent. And I'm adding these little SRBs to the side boosters just here, just to make sure they do definitely separate from the craft once they have been drained of their fuel. We're going for an onion. I think it's called onion staging. It's like asparagus, but it's not quite as complex as that. Those 4 peripheral towers are feeding into the central vector cluster. So once they've run out of fuel, they'll detach, but the central core will remain filled with fuel. It won't consume any of its own fuel until those 4 towers are drained. And here we are on the launch pad. 3, 2, 1, let's go! Oh my goodness. It's very slow. We should probably speed up this footage. Let's just rewind. Let's just do a quick rewind and play this back at ×4 normal speed, just to make things a little bit more enjoyable for you guys. And hello everyone that might have skipped through the build. I know the time lapses aren't for everyone, so some people might have skipped ahead to the launch. Welcome back to my video, and hey guys, shameless plug, if you are enjoying this video, then do leave a like down below. They really do help me out. Turns out liking videos and asking people to subscribe, it makes an absolutely monumental difference to the lifetime of a channel, so any kind of support from you guys means the world to me. Anyway, we are now getting well underway with our gravity turn. We're tilting very, very slightly towards the 90-degree vector, but we're going for a much steeper ascent profile than what I normally go with, just because I don't know how obvious this was to you guys, but this is not a very aerodynamic payload. It doesn't really, it's not the most stable thing. We are offsetting the aerodynamic awfulness by having the vector engines, which have an absolutely enormous gimbal range and can really help to keep unstable payloads under control, but even so, there's only really so much they can do. So I'm going to try and do our gravity turn a little bit more gradually, a little bit slower than I might normally do, just so that when we're flying in a flatter trajectory, we're flying in the upper atmosphere where air resistance and aerodynamics are less of an important thing than lower down. So we are now pointing 45 degrees, so we're kind of doing a nice compromise of accelerating horizontally whilst also increasing our apoapsis height. And speaking of our apoapsis height, I'm aiming for a final apoapsis of about 120 kilometers, which is a little bit higher than I normally go, but I'm aware that we're going to have to do our interplanetary burn using nuclear engines, and our payload is very, 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 very heavy. It's really the perfect recipe for having an abysmal thrust to weight ratio, really. So when we have to do that very, very long burn, because it's so long, we're going to have to start it well before our maneuver node point, which means we're going to start in almost a completely radially in position, which is going to force down our periapsis quite a bit during the burn. So we want to make sure our orbital height is nice and high so that when our periapsis starts getting forced down as we begin that burn, it's not going to dip below the atmospheric line, which would of course be a pretty bad thing because then we'd start counteracting our burn by, encountering air resistance. And there go the lower stages there. We've got a perfect Korolev Cross-esque detachment just there. They've cleared the payload nice and safely. And, we are well on our way to orbit. In fact, we've nearly reached orbital velocity, and we've got a lot of fuel left in this lower stage. Yes, it was not my intention to use this lower stage for anything more than just getting into low Kerbin orbit. In fact, when I tested this craft, I was running out of fuel pretty much at this sort of point, really. I had to finish circularizing my orbit using the nuclear engine stage. So I must have just flown this attempt really, really efficiently, because now we've got, just about 700 meters per second of delta V remaining. Obviously, we're going to have to do a bit more burning to get ourselves into a circular orbit, but we still got a lot of fuel left over. So I'm going to actually use some of the remaining fuel in that vector engine stage to begin doing our burns towards Laythe. I never intended to do just the one burn to get to Laythe because we have very, very poor thrust-weight ratio in this thing. It's just not really feasible to do the entire burn in one go. So I thought that we may as well begin doing our escape burns to Laythe using the remaining fuel of that vector engine stage. And, as a nice bonus, it has very high thrust-weight ratio, so it'll be a little bit less tedious than having to solely rely on the nuclear engines for our escape burn. Now, boys and girls, I know at this stage some of you might be worrying, Matt, if that lower stage is no longer on a ballistic trajectory, when you detach it, it'll just remain stuck in orbit, thus endangering the space polar bears. And do not worry, viewers, I too have thought of that, but luckily we have a probe core and an SAS wheel on that lower vector stage, so once it's nearly exhausted all of its fuel, we can then detach it and separate it, and then it can just deorbit itself and make sure it doesn't stay stuck in space forever. So we're going to do, what's that burn say there? It's a very, very blurry image on my screen. 445 point something meters per second, which is just shy of the total delta V capacity of that lower stage there. So we're going to do our initial burn just here. And once we get up, we're going to just do the burn basically and then warp up to apoapsis, and then we'll detach that stage and activate the nuclear engines. Now, you may have seen me briefly checking with the maneuver node maker that we could in fact get a Laythe Encounter on this sort of trajectory. Basically, I made a maneuver that would get us on a Jool system encounter, and then once I got that, I then dragged back on the retrograde marker to reduce the size of the burn, and we're going to just keep on replicating that maneuver node with each burn that we do. We know that we're on the right sort of angle to get to the Jool system. Okay, so we've now detached the two craft. I want to just give this thing enough time to separate, and then we're going to try and point it in a slightly different direction so that it doesn't crash back into the space station. The SAS wheel is quite weak though, so I'm going to just let it rotate on its own volition to get back to the retrograde vector, and then we can fire up the vector engines again and deorbit ourselves. Obviously, our delta V went up massively once we detached it from that space station because, of course, it no longer has to haul the enormous dry mass of this craft here. Now, I want to draw your attention to that orange tank here, and that's the main reason why this thing was so difficult to move about. In fact, what I'm doing here, I'm moving the camera around just to make sure there are no struts that are attaching either of those wheels to the central station core itself. I've done many missions like this where I thought I only attached the rotating rings to the scaffolding structures that I put in place, but sometimes either I miss something or misclick during the editing, or I feel like sometimes the game loads things incorrectly occasionally because I've actually reloaded stations that worked fine, only to find that a mysterious phantom strut has appeared, even though that wasn't there when I finished filming the video. Long story. Anyway, it's good to just do a quick visual inspection at various stages in the mission to make sure that the rings are definitely only attached via struts to the scaffold structure. So we've done our first nuclear engine burn. I wanted to split it over a few different burns, like we've already done one separate one with the vector engines, because these things have terrible thrust to weight ratio and the burn is going to be very long. So it would make more sense to split it into multiple burns, because that way we're going to be spending more time burning at periapsis, which is of course the most efficient place to do burns of this nature, because we're making the most of the Oberth effect, which states that the closer you are to your periapsis, the more efficient retrograde or prograde burns will be. Obviously, I mentioned another good reason to do this early, because as you can see, it's going to be a very long burn. We're going to have to start it quite a bit before we reach our prograde mark. As you can see, we're pointing basically straight towards the planet. So we didn't really want the burn to be any longer than this, because then we'd have to start it even sooner, and then we'd run an even greater risk of lowering our periapsis too much and have it enter the atmospheric border. There you go. You can see our periapsis has lowered by 20 kilometers during this series of burns. So that's why I said earlier that we wanted to have a nice high orbital height before we initiated our interplanetary escape burns, or, our series of interplanetary escape burns. But in terms of their status, it is pretty much done. We are now on a course to Jool in just a second. 3, 2, 1. There we are. We are now on a Jool encounter. Obviously, we're still quite far away from the planet, as in, our eventual periapsis is quite far away from Jool, because Jool is on a bit of a tilt compared to Kerbin's orbit around the sun. So we're going to have to do an interplanetary correction burn for a couple of reasons, actually. The first thing is, as I said, we're a bit tilted relative to Jool at the moment, so we're passing the planet a bit too high, so we need to do an inclination change to get ourselves on Jool's plane, or at least Laythe's plane. But the other reason is so we can get an encounter with not Laythe, but Tylo. See, by using Tylo's enormous gravity well, we can do a gravity assist to get ourselves into a captured Jool orbit for free. We won't have to do any burns at Jool periapsis to get ourselves captured around the green planet. All we have to do is play around with that. Need to drag on that retrograde a bit more. There we go. And if we just zoom out, you can see it puts us on a capture around Jool. You want to make sure your Jool periapsis is about the same height as Laythe. You don't need to go any lower than Laythe. In fact, it would be very counterintuitive to do so, because to enter an orbit of a planet, you basically need to have your spacecraft match the orbit of that planet first around whatever object it's orbiting. So in this case, we need to match our orbit around Jool to Laythe, and then our relative velocity to Laythe is 0, so we'll just enter a stable Laythe orbit. So it's counterintuitive to lower your periapsis around Jool any lower than Laythe, because then once you enter Laythe's sphere of influence and have to do a capture burn, you're then going to have to effectively raise your Jool periapsis again. I hope that made sense. Anyway, I'm aware at this point that there are probably going to be people asking in the comments and on Twitter or whatever, asking me, hey Matt, I don't really understand how you planned that Tylo gravity assist. Can you go into it in a bit more detail, or maybe do a Tylo gravity assist tutorial? But the thing is, my recommendation would be to just practice it for yourself. It is actually a lot more intuitive than it seems, and you'll just sort of get it. Basically do what I'm doing. Do a little, maybe not to this scale obviously, but do a little mission to Jool, and then once you've done your inclination change on the way to Jool, try and get an encounter with Tylo. The only thing you really have to bear in mind is that your actual Tylo encounter needs to occur before your Jool periapsis, and you don't really want your periapsis around Jool to be that much lower than Tylo. Like, certainly you don't want to have it any lower than Laythe, ideally. So that's what you got to try and do, really. Have your Jool periapsis to be around between Tylo and Laythe's height, ideally, and then you want to make sure that your Tylo encounter happens before your Jool periapsis. From there, basically just zoom out on the map screen a bit so you can kind of see the whole Joolian system, and just play around with the nodes on the nav ball and just see what happens to your predicted orbit. And if you get it right, so you pass kind of close to Tylo's surface but not too close, you can get an orbit that looks like this. Really, it's just practice, and it won't be that intuitive at first. It will take quite a few attempts to get it. The first time you do it, you'll probably sit there for like half an hour just playing around with the movement maker, trying to get it to work, and it won't seem to work, and it'll be really frustrating, and then suddenly it'll just happen, and then you'll be like, oh, it's happened. And then when you get that, just zoom in on the map screen, have a little look around, see what you did, see what kind of was working, what wasn't working, and then once you've done that, do the mission, and then do another one. And the more you do it, the quicker you'll get it. And like, when I first did it, it took me ages to get the Tylo gravity assists to work properly. But then now I don't even have to think about it. I can just do it. It's one of those things, you just got to practice, you can teach yourself, and then once you've got it once or twice, it'll be second nature. So I would recommend, basically, the message I'm saying is to get good at something, you just got to practice. Yes, groundbreaking stuff and information on this channel. Anyway, we are now captured at Jool. You can see me doing my burn that's gonna get us our Laythe Encounter. I did overshoot it a little bit, so I'm gonna have to quickly do a burn in the opposite direction just to make our Laythe periapsis above Laythe's atmosphere, which for Laythe is 50 kilometers, I believe, is Laythe's atmospheric border. So I think for my eventual orbit, I wanted to aim for 75 kilometers above the moon. But we're going to have to do a few burns first to get ourselves into that orbit, because the other thing I wanted to do was have it be an equatorial orbit, which at the moment it's not going to be that. We're coming in at quite a bit of a tilt. So we're going to do one burn just to capture at Laythe, and then we're going to do another burn to adjust our inclination, and then we're going to do a final burn, or two burns, I can't remember now, to get ourselves into a circular orbit. So that's what we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is just about capture, and then we'll go from there, because basically, generally, the more eccentric your orbit, the cheaper inclination changes will be, because, you know, for inclination changes to be as cheap as possible, you've got to do them as far away from your periapsis as possible. So having a more eccentric orbit can help. Okay, so we're doing our capture burn here, trying to think if there's anything interesting to talk about. I mean, look at Jool. Isn't that amazing? I mean, people are going to ask probably what my graphic mods are, and I don't really like saying what my graphical mods are in a video, because videos, they are timeless, right? Some of my most viewed videos this week were videos I uploaded like 2 years ago. YouTube seems to like recommending my old videos for some reason, so I feel like if I say it, whatever I say is going to be outdated within a few months when KSP gets an update and some mods don't get an update, or some mods aren't updated anymore, and then I have to switch to a different graphical mod. I believe in this case I'm using Scatterer definitely, and then environmental visual enhancements, and I believe I'm using the shaders from Astronomer's visual pack. I think that's what I'm using. Actually, I kind of just install visual mods and then just forget about it until they break, and then I have to go, right, I need to just install them all again. So then I just go on Google and type in KSP visual mods and then just see what's been updated and then go from there. That would be my recommendation to you. Just go on Google, type in KSP visual mods, or, you know, go on Reddit, how to install visual mods, and there'll be a nice guide to make KSP look as nice as my version of KSP. So, yep, we did our capture burn. Now we're doing our inclination change, which is sadly fairly close to our Laythe periapsis. It would have been ideal to do it at our Laythe apoapsis, but time's of the essence here, guys. Let's just get it done. And we've got enough delta V, because we ended up having a lot more delta V than I initially thought we'd have, because we got to use so much of the remaining fuel in the vector engine stage to begin our interplanetary escape burns. And, you know, I was trying to decide what to do with that lower stage. I mean, that lower stage does have a probe core on board, much like the vector engine stage. So the initial plan was that it would use basically all of its fuel to get here, and then we could just deorbit it into Jool or Laythe and have it be destroyed. But since we've got so much liquid fuel left in that lower stage with the engines, I decided just to leave it attached to the space station, and then it can serve as a refueling node for like the space planes and stuff that we'll inevitably need to employ the use of, because of course, as I said, this is a full Laythe colonization series, so we're going to have ground stations, ocean bases, things like that. We're going to need some sort of surface to space transportation system, so it'd be useful to have that liquid fuel tank there just to refuel those fuel tanks of the spacecraft that we'll eventually use in this series. Which brings me to another point. Actually, it doesn't, and this kind of feeds into it anyway, but I'll quickly talk about what I'm doing here. I've lowered my periapsis to enter Laythe's atmosphere so that we can now detach these scaffolding pieces, and they'll just be deorbited. They'll be left in space. There they go. How satisfying was that, guys? And then we can quickly spin around and fire up the nuclear engines again to re-enter a stable orbit for this space station. And this is awkward now, because I remember bringing this up earlier, and then I got distracted. I'm like a little dog looking at things and I forget about what I was doing. Yes, I mentioned that we've got that orange fuel tank just there, and that's the heaviest part of this space station. The reason why it's such a problem is the fact that I didn't want to use any of that fuel for, you know, actually getting to Laythe. That is purely there as a refueling point, and it's a very, very big tank, very, very heavy tank. That's why that's there, and that's why that was a problem. It's not necessarily because it was so heavy, but because it wasn't providing any useful weight. It is purely dead weight for actually getting this thing to Laythe. So that's why the interplanetary tug seems a bit bigger than it should be for a space station of this size. It's because it's got that gigantic orange tank attached to it, which is adding obviously a lot of mass. And there we are. Our apoapsis and periapsis nodes are pretty much the same height, and pretty much the same height is pretty much good enough for me. So I'm happy to leave it there. And there we have our space station in its final form, I guess. And I guess it does look pretty cool having those nuclear engines still attached, because we've got a nice sort of spire appearance and, you know, those curved arms that held the scaffold in place. It's kind of a nice visual flair. So maybe it all worked out quite well in the end, that we ended up with too much fuel than we really needed. Anyway, we've got a nice sort of UI-less cinematic shot of those rings rotating. They are going a bit faster than I would like them to be because their radius is too small for a speed of this size. Really, the gravity inside those rings is a bit too high, but unfortunately, the minimum RPM you can have rotors in this game is 5 rotations per minute, so it'll have to do, but the Kerbals, as long as it prevents muscle atrophy and bone atrophy, I'm sure it'll be fine. And there we are. We've got Jool looming ahead in the distance. Yes, I'm pretty happy with how this station turned out. I'd say this is definitely one of my prettier looking space stations, if I might be so bold as to make that claim. But I think it's time to get a Kerbal out on EVA and do a quick visual inspection of the structure. Make sure it's all looking okay. So we've got our Kerbal here with his little EVA pack. I think the first thing we need to do is do an epic fly through that rotating ring just there. So we've got our danger points in for this mission. And then we can go to the science laboratory here to get those experiments deployed. Probably would have been better for me to take a scientist on EVA so I could actually run these experiments. But at the end of the day, this series is more about the ambition of colonizing Laythe and trying to unravel the mysteries, which of course don't come in the stock game. We've got to do that figuring out for ourselves. So there's not much value in doing these experiments themselves, but we can do things like deploy the boom arm so it looks a bit more epic looking and stuff like that. But yes, whilst he's on EVA, I'm now... guys, it's coming into my earpiece now. The scientists on board that lab are beginning their analysis of the moon of Laythe. And yes, it is indeed liquid water in those oceans. It's not methane or something like that, which bodes the question exactly why it's not a frozen hellscape and why it is, in fact, liquid. This is all very interesting stuff, guys. We're going to have to do some more investigations, I think. And yes, they are now radioing through again, saying we should probably have some sort of mission down to the oceans of Laythe so we can do a more thorough analysis than what we can do from Laythe orbit. So, I don't know, guys. We should probably establish some sort of ocean colony for the surface of Laythe. Now, I know I have built ocean colonies for even Laythe before, but those have always been floating outposts, not too interesting. And I think if we want to do a proper analysis of Laythe's seas, we need to go a bit deeper than that. Literally, have some sort of colony that can both float on the surface, but also at will sink down to the seabed so we can do a thorough analysis both of the upper seas, but also the deep, dark depths. So look forward to that, guys. That's going to be the next installment of Laythe on Laythe. Some sort of mission that can explore the seas. So look forward to that. If you're not subscribed to the channel, then do hit that subscribe button so that you can see that video when it comes out, which I'm hoping for a release of next Saturday. But it's an ambitious mission. It might take a little bit longer than a week. So who knows? But I'm hoping by next Saturday, we should be able to do that mission, and I can show you guys the next phase of life on Laythe, but cue the end screen. If you guys would like to watch my previous Laythe endeavors, there is a link to the full Life on Laythe playlist on the left-hand side of the screen. The right-hand side, I don't know what it is because it was auto-generated by YouTube's recommendation bots based on your viewing habits, and in the description you'll find links to Twitter, Discord, social media, merchandise, things like that. So yeah, I think I can call that a wrap. Thank you for watching and have a great day.